Hey church, and welcome to this week's small group. Now I want to remind you what we talked about on Sunday, that budgeting leads to freedom. Now, as we think about that, for this small group, I want to answer a question as a small group. And the question is going to be, why is budgeting so important to our spiritual lives? And this is the question, this is the driving question for the entire small group, and I'm actually going to ask it of you at the very end. But I wanted to kind of ask it in the beginning so you know where we're going. So starting out our small group this week, I want to ask these two questions. What does it mean when it's to be a steward of something? And why do you think most people believe that they have a right to their possessions? Next, I want you to read 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verses 9 through 11. The people had given a huge offering for the temple. So why weren't they praising each other? Why weren't they going around giving each other high fives because they had done an awesome thing? And what game-changing principle do you find in these passages? How might this principle change the lives of people today? What would you find most difficult to freely hand over to God, and why? And how would our lives change if we stopped seeing ourselves as the owners of our money, but rather we saw ourselves as stewards of God's money? Next, I want you to read 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verses 12 through 13. How were the Israelites saying thank you to God in these passages? And is it possible to significantly thank God with our finances without budgeting for it? Why or why not? Next, I want you to read 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verses 14 through 16. What does David mean by the question posed in verse 14? And why is it important to God that we be cheerful givers? What is the deeper spiritual problem when someone gives reluctantly instead of cheerfully? What I want you to see is that David is saying that he cannot take credit for his own donation, because it all came from God to begin with. God is way more generous than David is. And so David is saying, who am I? I can't even take credit for this. And when someone gives reluctantly, it's because they have forgotten whose money it really is. When we truly understand and we truly believe that it all belongs to God, then giving 10% or even more is actually quite easy and can be a lot of fun. Next, I want you to read 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verses 17 through 18. How might some people give to God with dishonest intent? Because David says to God that he has given with honest intent. And David wanted this desire to give to God to become a permanent part of their lives. So what are some practical ways that we can always be cheerful givers? Something you need to know is in the ancient religions, the ancient pagan religions, they used to make sacrifices so that they could manipulate their gods into doing what they wanted their gods to do. It wasn't a sign of submission. It was, hey, we're trying to make the gods happy so that the gods will do what we want them to do. Sadly, still to this day, some people treat God that way because they think that since they've given a certain amount of money that God somehow owes them an easy life. But what we find is that that's a bad theology, because it all belongs to God to begin with, and so God doesn't owe us anything. How might budgeting help us to be cheerful givers? And this is the question that I asked in the beginning, and this is So now that we've gone through the entire small group, why is budgeting important to our spiritual lives? So I want to remind you once again that budgeting leads to freedom. I want you to close in prayer as a small group today and ask God to help us budget and to change our lives through the 90-day tithing challenge. God bless you and have a great rest of your week. We'll see you on Sunday.